Welcome to Beyond Listening. We are going to talk today about deciding how to decide, about decision making, and kind of blowing up the assumptions that we have about how and why and who makes decisions. So before we get into the meat of this, I think it's worth talking about what is a decision, and what is power. We always refer back to our friend Julie Diamond's definition of power, which is the ability to impact our environment. So power is the ability to impact our environment. We do that every time we take action, and every action that we take involves either a conscious or an unconscious decision to do something. Obviously, there's individual decisions, whether we actually can make decisions individually. I'm not quite sure if that's true. I think that we're constantly responding to whole complex systems of things which are influencing us. But let's just assume for the moment that we have individual agency and we make a decision to do something. Also, when it comes to groups make decisions. We do this in a variety of ways. We can do this through nominating or consenting to somebody else's leadership to make decisions. And then our consent is a decision to participate, to say yes to whatever that decision was. Or we can go all the way to groups getting together and kind of tussling out what it is that they're going to do next. So the crux of the conversation today is going to be about breaking down the types of decisions that individuals or groups make, or people in systems of other people, those are called organizations, make. And our hope today is that in thinking about how you decide or how the structures around you are making decisions, you start to question everything. Because one of the impacts of this is that we start to see, hey, maybe this isn't the only way. Maybe some of the things that we take for granted in an organization in our own lives are not necessarily the only way.
Yeah, it's like going under the iceberg. We often use the classic iceberg model, and you're really in this chipping away at the underlying assumptions. And always, I just want to call out in deciding how to decide, just call out conscious conversations, where I at least first heard that phrase and first started to think about this, and also kind of link it back into Julie Diamond's work. One of the things that has always stayed with me from her work was her talking about people don't actually want to be involved in all the decisions. They don't necessarily want to decide, but what they do want in order to build trust is that the how the decisions are made is transparent. And so this is, fundamentally this is about this, is how to make the decisions you make transparent and how they align to your purpose and your mission and your aims.
So I just, want to invite you to take a moment right now to think about the last time you thought about how to make a decision. In other words, like when you took a pause and you thought, what would be the best way to make this decision? I want you to think of a personal example of that. It might be a choice point that you're making in your life, something, as simple as where am I going to go to dinner? Or it could be something, kind of life-changing crossroads kind of change. And just think about how you went about deciding, not deciding what you were going to do, but deciding how you were going to decide. So hopefully you came up with some examples. And it might be worthwhile, if you're interested in the topic of this conversation, to think about where you learned how to make that decision. So maybe someone in the past said to you, make a list of pros and cons, right? Or someone might have said, hey, this is one I like. You can't lose. You're going out to dinner, maybe someone you like to spend time with. Doesn't really matter where you go. Just pick one. Flip a coin. That's another way to make a decision. So that's relatively, hopefully, maybe you thought of a powerful example, maybe you thought of a simple one. But now I want to invite you to think about an organizational system that you're part of, whether that's a team, could be a family, could be the political system that you live within, and hopefully participate in. When was the last time you thought about how are you deciding on an issue? And I'm going to want to invite you to go big here. So think of something that had a lot of impact. Maybe it was a long-term, maybe it was a stressful decision. Maybe you knew that it was going to impact other people's lives. Maybe it seemed to be risky. And then again, think about where you learned how to make that decision. Did it come from a previous boss or a mentor? Is it just the way things are done in the organization that you're a part of? And the key here is to think about in this brief exercise, did you explore alternative options? For example, maybe you're used to making command-based decisions, and there's nothing wrong with that, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But maybe you were starting to think about, there's a lot of people going to be impacted by this. Maybe people's jobs were on the line, or their well-being, or you're thinking about their families, or you're thinking about the long-term success of a mission. Did you think about other ways of doing it? And if so, how did you decide which way to go? Not on the outcome, but on the tool that you're going to use to decide, the method. So that's what deciding how to decide looks like in its most basic form. We're going to break down, or Miriam's going to break down right now, like how the kind of fundamental information that's needed to make the decision on how to decide. But before she does, I'm going to say one more thing. This is risky. This is why a lot of people don't do it. Because when we start questioning the means by which we decide on things, we are starting to question the structures of the system itself. If you want to destabilize a country, throw into question their system of voting and participation. If you want to pull apart a democracy, throw into question the very fundamental mechanics of the participation of the citizens in that democracy. Hopefully you can think of some examples from recent history where this has happened. Miriam.
So when we're approaching deciding how to decide, we're thinking in the system that we use, we're thinking about two things. Time. So how much time does this decision need, or how much time can you take to make that decision? And we're thinking about the amount of people who that decision impacts and needs to be involved. So those are the two factors we're considering when we think about those, when we're thinking about decision making. And we use a couple of categories just to break it down, and there are many more, but just to break down some examples of when there's less time, less people, more people. So the first one is command. So a command decision is one that takes a little time, not much time, and doesn't involve anyone else except for the person making the decision. Their capacity to assess the situation and their capacity to then decide and communicate that decision. Command. Often used in crisis situations very effectively when an immediate decision needs to be made and acted upon. Also used a lot in operational decisions when someone's operating and they're making decisions all the time that they're in charge of, and they need to make them quickly and they need to adjust quickly to the environment and the circumstances that they're in. Voting is the next one. So that involves a lot of people, but again, doesn't take a lot of time. So, of course, our major example of voting is in the US is our political system, is run on a system of voting. We get input from all the people who choose to participate, and it's done in a day. Now, you could argue with voting. Many people would say, no, it's not done in a day because of the lobbying. And the lobbying takes a long time. And of course, there is voting leading up to it, voting in the parties. So again, voting, a form of majority rules. Let's skip now to something which is related to command. So it's still one person making a decision or one group of people making a decision, but they're consulting. So it's a consult decision. So a group of people or one person consult with experts, consult with people in the field so that they can make an informed decision. Something often used at the board level of organizations, often used with a manager, with a team, when they consult the team. And really useful way of both kind of limiting the time so not everyone is making the decision, but also involving people. Classic mistake with this that we've seen a lot in organizational systems is that the person who is making the decision is consulting, but it isn't transparent they're consulting. And so people feel like they're actually making the decision with the manager or the leader, and they're not. The manager or the leader is just gathering information. Consensus. So consensus takes a lot of time and involves a lot of people. It's where everyone agrees that the decision that they will go ahead with the decision, or they give it over to the group. So that it can be done with a lot of people, but it's going to take a lot of time to get everyone to agree. And then consent, which is kind of in the middle. If we were looking at a graph, it's in the middle. And that is, we use this a lot in organizational systems. Takes less time than consensus, can involve a lot of people. But consent is where, from the position of your role and responsibility in the group, you're okay with it.
But often, I would say it's convenient to break these into distinct categories, but they also go hand in hand with each other. So, for example, we might elect an official through a voting process that then uses consult to make decisions. Ideally, that's what the president and their cabinet are doing in the United States. They get elected, and then they're using consult, and then it's when they make a decision, they might be empowering others to make command-based decisions. So that's going to kind of lead us into the next thing, which is about knowing when and where to make these decisions, and the pitfalls of each of these has a pitfall, kind of a de facto pitfall, and each has their benefit as well. So it's easy to break things into small categories, but they're not exactly like that. So how do we decide on which one? Miriam mentioned there's a time, there's kind of an XY axis that includes the time it's going to take to make the decision or the time that you have. I think the easiest one to explain there is that one, the example you used, Miriam, command in an emergency situation or where the impact is reversible or small. We don't need to involve a lot of people. Maybe we can't involve a lot of people. We don't want to take a lot of time, and maybe we can't use a lot of time. So we'll put in the notes here a link to a diagram that shows this. But there's some other questions that become useful. And we're recently working with a client who their organization, this is a strategic, they're thinking about strategically growing their outreach. There's very little expertise on the team, or at least there's no expert role on the team for how to move forward with the technology around media outreach. And so they're kind of, they ask a question, should this be a group decision about how we go forward with a general policy about outreach, barring some expert on there, who should be a part of this team? So we want to run through, there's a couple questions that are useful to ask here in deciding how to decide. The first one is, who cares? Right? So if we think about, I'm going to use kind of, probably for most people that are listening, most of us probably live in a representative democracy. Who cares about the policies that are being enacted by the federal government, for example? Probably all of us to some degree care. Most of us care. So for that reason, we have a voting system that gives us all an opportunity, ideally, to participate in the highest level of policymaking for the country, even if that's through our countries, even if that's through representative government. When it comes to smaller examples of this, let's say, who cares about what's happening in my little town? Miriam's not voting on what's happening up here in a small town in Oregon, right? Because she doesn't care. She doesn't know. It's not going to impact her to a great, directly. So she's not caring. So she's not participating in that. Right. And there may be people in an organization who act like they care. So we want to involve them in decision making. And then they start to find out, well, actually, I don't care that much about that issue. I remember an example when Miriam and I enacted new forms of decision making together at an organization. And everybody seemed to care about this issue. So we said, okay, great. We're all going to make a decision on this issue. Here's the budget. When you understand, like, we're going to start giving you the budget and the financials every month, because these have budgetary impact. And that's a prerequisite to getting involved in these decisions, because they're budgetary decisions. I think it was 1 or 2 months later, about half that group said, actually, we don't care that much. It doesn't actually impact our job that much. We don't really want to take the time to understand financials. We spend a lot of time actually explaining them, things like that. But actually, I think this is too stressful. This is too much for me. I don't really care that much. So it's worth questioning who actually cares enough to get involved in the decision-making process, because that's the criteria that we're looking for. The second one is who knows, like who has the information. Oftentimes it is going to be the highest level within an organization. Ideally, in terms of hierarchy, the people at the higher levels have more of a broad scope of information and understand how all the different parts of an organization connect together. And the people that are doing the actual work, either metaphorically or on the ground or in that particular area, are going to know more about that. So, try to think outside the box when it comes to answering this question, who knows? Also, stakeholders that are not part of the current decision-making structure, like, let's say we're working with an organization that's helping students. The students probably know a lot about what they need. So getting them involved in the decision might be worthwhile. Who must agree? This can be, you can think about this from a hierarchical organizational structure perspective, like who has the power to actually move this forward from a structural perspective, but also who's going to resist the decision once it's made. If we make a decision that's going to impact all the staff in their jobs, are they just going to not follow through or do a half-assed job at the thing, half-assed participation, because they didn't get to participate, or it's a bad decision that's really going to negatively impact their ability to do their job? They might just ignore it. So who must agree? And then how many people is worth involving? Like, how much time do we have? Can we do this more efficiently, effectively? Can we get this back to the national representation? Can we get representatives from different groups rather than every person from those groups? How do we decide on those representatives would be a good question too. And then finally, like, how long is this decision what's the time frame for this decision's impact? Is it immediately reversible? Maybe we can make a quick decision and iterate with a smaller group. If it's going to have long-lasting, wide-reaching impacts, we're moving towards including a greater amount of people and a longer-term process. So all of those things are, when you look at that XY axis, you want to be thinking about, all of those questions. And then the more impact and the larger number of people that you want to involve, you're going to move up the spectrum in terms of time and people.
And we've used this deciding how to decide. We've introduced this idea in so many different organizations, because one of the things that we're constantly working on in organizational systems is alignment, making sure the way or guiding people with with the way they're doing things matches what they're trying to achieve. And, it took every time we would introduce this, people would get a bit miffed, like confused. And I was like, is it because we're not explaining it right? Or why is it so confusing? And that's really when we started to realize that it's confusing because it checks, and it sort of, it's confusing because it disrupts forms of leadership and followership. It disrupts assumptions around who's responsible for the decision making and who's not, and what that relationship is. So within this, there's also connected to it the idea that as a leader or as a manager, there are different forms of leadership with deciding how to decide. That you're moving from command and consult primarily into more of a facilitative style of leadership, one where you're facilitating a conversation with a group.
And I think it's worth pointing out, part of the issue is that the people who are deciding how to decide are taking a fundamental power. They're making a fundamental power move because they're reshuffling the deck. So people in power in the former structural system are rightfully going to be suspicious, right? So if we were operating in a sort of like, let's say the benevolent leader, right, is operating from a command based power structure and using consult to build trust and make better decisions. There's nothing wrong with this. But all of a sudden, the organization's a group is moving towards more of a consent or consensus-based system. All of a sudden, the leader and probably others within the system as well are going to they're not going to know whether they can trust the new decision making. And this is less about the outcomes, by the way. The outcomes may be exactly the same, but trust in the system itself, and you go back to our trust podcast to hear, what does systemic trust look like, is going to be threatened. It has to be rebuilt. Another alternative is there's the benevolent leader and the malignant leader, but there's also using different structures of governance to forward an agenda, right? So I might have a very strong opinion about the current leadership, a negative opinion, and want to sort of, or my role, it feels like it's disempowered in an organization. One way that I could overcome that and sort of assert my power would be to threaten the current system of governance or decision making, propose another one where I, as someone who's outside of the hierarchical structure, could forward an agenda. And that's certainly happened in our experience, where the the sort of the disempowered use the tools of deciding how to decide in order to destabilize a system and sort of in order to take more power or to move forward an agenda. I think it's a valid, I think I could make a great conspiracy theory about how that's happening, back to my earlier example, in the United States, but also it's happened in a number of countries where democracies have failed by the sort of, again, the questioning of one system of governance, not because of necessarily the decisions, but using the mechanics of the participation in the decisions as the means for overcoming. So there's a shadow side to this, in the sense that what can look like a sheep, like we want to get more participation from the group, can actually be a wolf, right? Attempting to sort of gain control.
Yeah.
Whether the outcomes are better or not, we're not even talking about that. We're talking about power and how it's moving through decisions.
Yeah. And at the same time as that shadow can be present, uh, it's becoming more and more of an issue in organizations. So we're seeing it become more and more of an issue in organizations because there's this need to more quickly adapt and move. A lot of information coming from a lot of sources, or problems that are so complex that they need new solutions, different ways of thinking about things. And they need to involve people in different ways, involve people's expertise, involve people's different ways of thinking about things in a way that can productively help the organization or the team adapt. So it's how can you introduce deciding how to decide, which will kind of somehow fundamentally, could rock the leadership and followership, the structures of the system. How can you use this in a way that is healthy for a team or an organization to be continually adapting, to be able to align decision-making models to what's needed, and be able to kind of involve people in a really healthy way, to innovate and to move new ideas and new ways of doing things forward that are needed in so many organizations now. And I think that's why we wanted to give you this kind of simple model up front, because some of it is about permission giving and a shared language. So the kind of permission giving in an organizational system and a shared language around that allows people to say, hey, wait, how should we make this decision? Does it impact a lot of people? Will it be better to engage people in the decision making process rather than, which is what was happening 20 years ago, kind of make a command decision and then engage people once the decision is already made? So it gives you more choices in terms of the forms that you use. It also requires a leader or a manager to be able to switch their leadership style from kind of command and consult into being able to facilitate groups and various groups, and collaborations effectively. And to know that the outcome of it might not be a quick decision. The outcome might be a generative conversation, which sparks new ideas. So it's the capacity to shift mindset. And that's what we're really working on. We're really working on the agility in the system, in the team, in the leader, to have different ways of working together that they can shift at any given time, to more effectively reach the outcomes that they need.
So we hope this short podcast, we're going to do more of these. Kind of they're tactical in a certain way, things that you can try out. You can start trying out. Okay, just that thought process. Number one, how are we deciding on this? Is this the best way? Think about those questions that we asked. Who knows? Who cares? How many people should we involve, et cetera? And then a range of ideas on how you can go about this. Our secret agenda is to get rid of Robert's rules of order. If you learn nothing else, please learn that is an archaic and probably destructive tool for making decisions at the highest level of nonprofit board organizations. That was a
You just
joke,
had to put that into you.
um, but seriously, starting to do this in an iterative way, thinking about where in your organization you can make small changes on a project level or on a team level that are viable places for experimentation, where you can learn from these.
Yeah, and I think it also, what we're trying to point to is that often structural change seems monstrous, because in a very complex system, to change the structure means that you have to think about all the component parts and have a plan for that. And what we've seen in using just this really simple idea is that there can be small incremental structural changes that can happen in teams and in projects. We'll also put a link. So we'll put a link to that model that we went through, and also just put a link to just a really simple slide that points towards, what command consult based leadership might look like and what facilitative leadership might look like, and the differences between those two, which might just be helpful in kind of thinking about your mind shift. Even if that mind shift is in your own personal leadership, in the way that you're thinking about your decisions, and in your family or community, but also on an organizational level, whether you be a leader or a follower. And just want to leave you with a thought of hopefully that there's some reflection on, particularly in your organizational system, being transparent about how you're making a decision, and knowing that that transparency is what can really effectively build trust.